The Great Second Advent Movement by J.N. Loughborough, Chapter 13, Tokens of Divine Guidance. Hath God essayed to go and take him a nation from the midst of another nation, by temptations, by signs, and by wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand, and by a stretched out arm, and by great terrors, according to all that the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Unto thee it was showed, that thou mightest know that the Lord, he is God. There is none else beside him. Deuteronomy 4, verses 34 and 35. It was thus that the Lord wrought in taking a people from the midst of a heathen nation, that he might lead them out where he could speak his law to them, and where he could hand it down to them graven in tables of stone. These wonders were not performed to gratify their curiosity, but that they might know of a certainty that he who had done great things in Egypt, wondrous works in the land of Ham, and terrible things by the Red Sea. Psalm 106, verses 21 and 22. And had spoken to them from amid the fire and smoke of Sinai's burning top, was none other than the living and true God, the maker of all things. Moses' call from the burning bush. Moses himself could not have moved the Israelites to leave Egypt by simply saying to them, "As I was tending the flocks in the desert, I had thoughts of sympathy for you in your bondage, and I am now come down to lead you out of Egypt, as I essayed to do when I slew the Egyptian just before I fled to the land of Midian." It took the burning bush that consumed not, and an audible voice proceeding from the midst of the flames, to convince even Moses that he was the one to go and lead the people out of Egypt. It was in this wonderful manner that he received his commission, his high and holy calling, a revelation of which would at once arrest the attention of his brethren and prepare their minds for what should follow, and thus lead them to accept Moses under God as their leader. If ever there was a time since the Savior's resurrection when his sorrowing and disappointed followers needed to be comforted by his presence and cheering words, it was at that time when some of the sad and persecuted believers were holding on by steadfast faith after the midnight cry of 1844, and if in mercy God ever communicated directly to sorrowing souls, it would seem that it would certainly be at such a time and to such a people. The presence of the Lord promised. He who is not limited in ways or means of working, and who placed the gifts of the Spirit in his church when he ascended up on high, Ephesians 4, verses 8 through 15, promised to be with his followers in preaching the gospel even unto the end of the world. All the way along, the Lord has been ready to show forth his power and his gifts with those who fully sought him. Did he not say, in giving the gospel commission, "These signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink anything deadly, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." Mark 16, verses 17 and 18. Gifts of the Spirit during the Reformation. There were some wonderful displays of the Lord's power and manifestations of the gift of prophecy during the Reformation of the 16th century and in the times following. D'Aubigné speaks of the prophecies of John Huss. Charles Buck, in his Religious Anecdotes, tells of the prophesying of George Wishart in 1546. John Wesley, in his works, tells of the prophecies of Jonathan Pyra and their fulfillment. Elder J.B. Finley, in his autobiography, tells of a remarkable vision and healing in his own person in the summer of 1842. The Christian Advocate, Methodist, published an interesting account of a remarkable vision and its results as given to Dr. Bond of that church during his ministry. These were tokens to those humbly seeking the Lord that he had not changed, and that he still would speak to his people through the prophetic gift. The remnant church to have the spirit of prophecy. There are plain and specific statements in the Scriptures that the Lord will specially manifest the gifts of His Spirit, and especially the gift of prophecy among the people who will be found waiting for His coming. The first text that we call attention to is found in the letter to the Corinthians and reads, I thank my God always on your behalf for the grace of God which is given you by Jesus Christ, that in everything ye are enriched by him, in all utterance and in all knowledge, even as the testimony of Christ was confirmed in you, so that ye come behind in no gift, waiting for the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, who shall also confirm you unto the end, that ye may be blameless in the day of our Lord Jesus Christ. 1 Corinthians 1, verses 4 through 8. In the Revelation we read of the remnant, the last gospel church. The dragon was wroth with the woman, church, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keeps the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Revelation 12, verse 17. What is the testimony of Jesus, we inquire, which the last church is to have, and which in its confirmation prepares the way for the manifestation of all the gifts of the Spirit? To this question, we find an answer in the testimony of the angel to John on the Isle of Patmos. I fell at his feet to worship him, and he said unto me, See thou do it not. I am thy fellow servant, and of thy brethren that have the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. Revelation 19, verse 10. This definition given by the angel shows that it is the spirit of prophecy manifest in the church that is waiting for Christ that prepares the way for all the gifts, and that war is made on the remnant church for having that gift among them. Paul's testimony on the gifts. Paul's letter to the Thessalonians shows that the day of the Lord, the final day of executive judgment, will come upon the masses as a thief in the night, but that it will not thus overtake the Lord's faithful children, because they are children of light and the children of the day. Among his admonitions to that watching people, he says, Quench not the spirit, despise not prophesyings, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 5, 19 through 21. Of the Greek word prophetias, here rendered prophesyings, Greenfield in his Greek lexicon says, the exercise of the gift of prophecy in this sense, 1 Thessalonians 5:20. With this also agree the lexicons of Parkhurst, Robinson, Liddell, and Scott. This, then, is a plain testimony that the true gift of prophecy will be with the church waiting for Christ's second coming. The admonition is not to despise the gift, but to prove it, finding the good manifestation to hold fast to it. Footnote: for a full canvass of the Bible testimony on the perpetuity of spiritual gifts, see Prophetic Gift in the Gospel Church, a pamphlet of 120 pages to be obtained from any of our publishing houses. A fulfillment of the promise. We have noted heretofore how the Lord began to manifest the gift of prophecy during the proclamation of the first and second angels' messages. This gift has been more fully developed since the close of the 2300 days. The Lord chose his own instrument for this purpose, selecting as his agent one who had not only surrendered all for him, but whose life trembled in the balance, the weakest of the weak, as was shown to Hazen Foss. Within 2 months after the passing of the time, Miss Ellen G. Harmon of Portland, Maine, then only about 17 years of age, began to receive revelations from the Lord. As I have had opportunity to converse with those living at Portland at the time of the first vision, and was also acquainted with Mrs. Haynes, at whose house Miss Harmon had her first vision, I will relate the facts as they were given me by those persons. Miss Harmon was at that time in a very critical condition of health. For a number of weeks she had scarcely been able to speak above a whisper. One physician had decided that her trouble was dropsical consumption. He said her right lung was decayed and the left one considerably diseased, and that her heart was affected. He said he did not think she could live but a very short time at most, and was liable to drop away at any time. It was with great difficulty that she could breathe when lying down. At night she obtained rest only by being bolstered up in bed in an almost sitting posture. Frequent spells of coughing and hemorrhages from the lungs had greatly reduced her physical strength. Miss Harmon's first vision. At the time she had her first vision, she was staying at the home of Mrs. Haynes. It was in the morning, and they were engaged in family worship. There were 5 persons present, all sisters in the faith. Others had prayed, and Miss Harmon was praying in a whisper, when the power of God came down in a most wonderful manner, manifestly affecting all who were present. And in a moment she was lost to all that was transpiring around her. She was in vision. In the next meeting, she related to the believers in Portland what had been shown her. They had full confidence that it was from the Lord. There were about 60 at that time in Portland who endorsed it as the work of the Lord. There was a power that attended the vision as well as the relation of it that could emanate only from the divine. A solemn sense of eternal interests was constantly upon her, and she seemed to be filled with an unspeakable awe that one so young and feeble as she should be chosen as an instrument through whom the Lord would communicate light to his people. She stated that while in the vision, she seemed to be surrounded by radiant angels in the glorious courts of heaven, where all is joy and peace, and that it was a sad change to awaken to the unsatisfying realities of this mortal life. Synopsis of the first vision. The following brief synopsis of her first vision, as related by her to the believers in Portland, will give some idea of the character of all of them. Quote, "While praying, the power of God came upon me as I had never felt it before. I was surrounded with light and was rising higher and higher from the earth. I turned to look for the Advent people in the world, but could not find them. when a voice said to me, "Look again, and look a little higher." At this I raised my eye, and saw a straight and narrow path, cast up high above the world. On this path the Advent people were traveling to the city, which was at the farther end of the path. They had a bright light set up behind them at the first end of the path, which an angel told me was the midnight cry. This shone all along the path and gave light for their feet, that they might not stumble. And if they kept their eyes fixed on Jesus, who was just before them, leading them to the city, they were safe. But soon some grew weary. They said the city was a great way off, and they expected to have entered it before. Then Jesus would encourage them by raising his glorious right arm, and from his arm came a bright light which waved over the Advent people, and they shouted, "Hallelujah!" Others rashly denied the light behind them and said that it was not God that had led them out so far. The light behind these went out, leaving their feet in perfect darkness, and lost sight of Jesus and fell off the path down into the dark and wicked world below. Soon we heard the voice of God like many waters, which gave us the day and hour of Jesus' coming. The living saints knew and understood the voice, while the wicked thought it was thunder and an earthquake. When God spake the time, he poured on us the Holy Spirit, and our faces began to light up and shine with the glory of God, as Moses' did when he came down from Mount Sinai. Close quote, Early Writings, pages 14 and 15. Description of Mrs. White's condition while in vision. Before we trace further the thrilling account of this wonderful manifestation of the Spirit of God, I will state some facts relative to the visions. The first time I saw Mrs. E.G. White, formerly Miss Harmon, was in October 1852. On that day, I saw her in a vision that lasted over 1 hour. Since that time, I've had the privilege of seeing her in vision about 50 times. I have been present when physicians have examined her while in this state, and I esteem it a pleasure to bear testimony to what I have seen and know. I trust a narration of the facts in the case may not be carelessly cast aside for the random supposition of those who have never seen her in this condition. In passing into vision, she gives 3 enrapturing shouts of glory which echo and re-echo, the second, and especially the third, fainter, but more thrilling than the first, the voice resembling that of one quite a distance from you, and just going out of hearing. For about 4 or 5 seconds, she seems to drop down like a person in a swoon, or one having lost his strength. She then seems to be instantly filled with superhuman strength, sometimes rising at once to her feet and walking about the room. There are frequent movements of the hands and arms pointing to the right or left as her head turns. All these movements are made in a most graceful manner. In whatever position the hand or arm may be placed, it is impossible for anyone to move it. Her eyes are always open, but she does not wink. Her head is raised, and she is looking upward, not with a vacant stare, but with a pleasant expression, only differing from the normal in that she appears to be looking intently at some distant object. She does not breathe, yet her pulse beats regularly. Her countenance is pleasant, and the color of her face florid as in her natural state, compared to that of Daniel. Her condition as to breathing, loss of strength, and being made strong as the angel of God touches her, all agree perfectly with the description given by the prophet Daniel of his own experience in vision when he says, "Therefore I was left alone, and saw this great vision, and there remained no strength in me, for my comeliness was turned in me into corruption, and I retained no strength. For how can the servant of this my Lord talk with this my Lord? For as for me, straightway there remained no strength in me, neither is there breath left in me. Then there came again and touched me one like the appearance of a man, and he strengthened me and said, O man greatly beloved, fear not, peace be unto thee. Be strong, yea, be strong. And when he had spoken unto me, I was strengthened, and said, Let my Lord speak, for thou hast strengthened me." Daniel 10, verses 8, 17 through 19. Close quote. Testimonials of Eyewitnesses. M.G. Kellogg, M.D. As to Mrs. White's condition while in vision, a few statements from eyewitnesses may be in place. The first is from M.G. Kellogg, M.D., who refers to the first vision given in Michigan, May 29, 1853, at a meeting held in Tyrone, Livingston County. He says, quote, "Sister White was in vision about 20 minutes or half an hour. As she went into vision, everyone present seemed to feel the power and presence of God, and some of us did indeed feel the Spirit of God resting upon us mightily. We were engaged in prayer and social meeting Sabbath morning at about 9 o'clock. Brother White, my father, and Sister White had prayed, and I was praying at the time. There had been no excitement, no demonstrations. We did plead earnestly with God, however, that He would bless the meeting with His presence, and that He would bless the work in Michigan. As Sister White gave that triumphant shout of glory, 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 which you have heard her give so often as she goes into vision, Brother White arose and informed the audience that his wife was in vision. After stating the manner of her visions, and that she did not breathe while in vision, he invited anyone who wished to do so to come forward and examine her. Dr. Drummond, a physician, who was also a First-day Adventist preacher, who, before he saw her in vision, had declared her visions to be of mesmeric origin, and that he could give her a vision, stepped forward, and after a thorough examination, turned very pale, and remarked, "She doesn't breathe." I am quite certain that she did not breathe at that time while in vision, nor in any of several others which she has had when I was present. The coming out of the vision was as marked as her going into it. The first indication we had that the vision was ended was in her again beginning to breathe. She drew her first breath deep, long, and full, in a manner showing that her lungs had been entirely empty of air. After drawing the first breath, several minutes passed before she drew the second, which filled the lungs precisely as did the first. Then a pause of 2 minutes, and a third inhalation, after which the breathing became natural. Close quote. Signed, M.G. Kellogg, M.D., Battle Creek, Michigan, December 28, 1890. F.C. Castle. We give the following statement from an individual who witnessed a medical examination of Mrs. White while in vision at Stowe, Vermont, in the summer of 1853. He says, quote, "A physician was present and made such examination of her as his wisdom and learning dictated to find the cause of the manifestation. A lighted candle was held close to her eyes, which were wide open. Not a muscle of the eye moved. He then examined her in regard to her pulse, and also in regard to her breathing, and there was no respiration. The result was that he was satisfied that it could not be accounted for on natural or scientific principles, close quote, signed F.C. Castle. D.H. Lamson. The following testimonials relate to an examination made while Mrs. White was in vision in a meeting held in the home of Elder James White on Monroe Street, Rochester, New York, June 26, 1854. Quote, I was then 17 years old. It seems to me I could almost hear those thrilling shouts of glory which she uttered. Then she sank back to the floor, not falling, but sinking gently, and was supported in the arms of an attendant. 2 physicians came in, an old man and a young man. Brother White was anxious that they should examine Sister White closely, which they did. A looking glass was brought, and one of them held it over her mouth while she talked. But soon they gave this up and said, she doesn't breathe. Then they closely examined her sides as she spoke to find some evidence of deep breathing, but they did not find it. As they closed this part of the examination, she arose to her feet, still in vision, holding a Bible up high, turning from passage to passage, quoting correctly, although the eyes were looking upward and away from the book. She had a view of the 7 last plagues. Then she saw the triumph of the saints, and her shouts of triumph I can seem to hear even now. To these facts I freely testify, close quote, signed, Elder D.H. Lamson, Hinsdale, Michigan, February 8, 1893. Mrs. Drusilla Lamson. Although another testimonial is given respecting the same medical examination from Mrs. Drusilla Lamson, widow of Elder Lamson's cousin and matron of Clifford Springs, New York Sanitarium. Speaking of the meeting of June 26, 1854, she says, quote, I remember the meeting when the trial was made, namely, to test what Brother White had frequently said, that Sister White did not breathe while in vision. But I cannot recall the name of the doctor who was present. It must have been Dr. Fleming, as he was the doctor sometimes called for counsel. He is, however, now dead. I can say this much, that the test was made, and no sign of breath was visible on the looking-glass. Close quote, signed, Drusilla Lamson, Clifton Springs, New York, March 9, 1893. Still another testimony from one who was present on the above-mentioned occasion. David Seeley. Quote, this is to certify that I had read the above testimonials of David Lamson and Mrs. Drusilla Lamson concerning the physician's statement when examining Mrs. E.G. White while she was in vision, June 26, 1854. I was present at that meeting and witnessed the examination. I agree with what is stated by Brother and Sister Lamson and would say further that it was Dr. Fleming and another younger physician who made the examination. After Mrs. White rose to her feet, as they have stated, quoting the text of Scriptures, Dr. Fleming called for a lighted candle. He held this candle as near her lips as possible without burning and in direct line with her breath in case she breathed. There was not the slightest flicker of the blaze. The doctor then said with emphasis, that settles it forever. There is no breath in her body. Close quote. Signed, David Seeley, Fayette, Iowa, August 20, 1897. Mr. and Mrs. A.F. Fowler. The following statements relate to an examination made while Mrs. White was in vision in Waldron's Hall, Hinsdale, Michigan, in the month of February 1857. Dr. Lord, a physician of Hinsdale of 50 years' practice, made a most careful examination concerning which I present the following testimonials. Quote, "We were present when, in February 1857, Sister E.G. White had a vision in Waldron's Hall, Hinsdale. Dr. Lord made an examination and said, 'Her heart beats, but there is no breath. There is life, but no action of the lungs. I cannot account for this condition.'" Close quote. Signed, A.F. Follower, Mrs. A.F. Follower, Hinsdale, Michigan, January 1, 1891. C.S. Glover. Here is given another statement concerning the same vision. Quote, "I was present when Sister White had the above-named vision in Waldron's Hall, Hinsdale. In addition to the above statement, I heard the doctor say that Sister White's condition in vision was beyond his knowledge. He also said, 'There is something supernatural about that.'" Close quote. Signed, C.S. Glover, Battle Creek, Michigan, January 19, 1891. Mr. and Mrs. Carpenter. Here is a third statement on the same case. Quote, "This is to certify that we were present in Waldron's Hall, Hinsdale, Michigan, in February 1857, when Mrs. E.G. White had a vision, and while in that condition was examined by Dr. Lord, and we heard this public statement respecting the case as given above by Brother and Sister Fowler. Signed, W.R. Carpenter, Eliza Carpenter, Noblesville, Indiana, August 30, 1891, close quote. D.T. Bardot. Your attention is next called to a test applied while Mrs. White was in vision at Bucks Bridge, St. Lawrence County, New York. Quote, "June 28, 1857, I saw Sister Ellen G. White in vision for the first time. I was an unbeliever in the visions, but one circumstance among others that I might mention convinced me that her visions were of God. To satisfy my mind as to whether she breathed or not, I first put my hand on her chest sufficiently long to know that there was no more heaving of the lungs than there would have been had she been a corpse. I then took my hand and placed it over her mouth, pinching her nostrils between my thumb and forefinger, so that it was impossible for her to exhale or inhale air, even if she had desired to do so. I held her thus with my hand about 10 minutes, long enough for her to suffocate under ordinary circumstances. She was not in the least affected by this ordeal. Since witnessing this wonderful phenomenon, I have not once been inclined to doubt the divine origin of her visions." Close quote. Signed, D.T. Bardot, Battle Creek, Michigan, February 4, 1891. A spirit medium doctor testing the vision. I will mention another medical examination that I witnessed at Parkville, St. Joseph County, Michigan, January 12, 1861. At the close of the exhortation given by Mrs. White to a large congregation that had assembled at the Adventist meeting house, the blessing of God rested upon her in a remarkable degree, and she was taken off in vision while seated in her chair. There was present a Dr. Brown, a hale, strong man, physically a spirit medium. He had said that her visions were the same as spirit mediumship, and that if she had one where he was, he could bring her out of it in 1 minute. An invitation was given for any who desired to do so to come forward and by examination satisfy themselves as to her condition while in vision. The doctor came forward, but before he had half completed his examination, he turned deathly pale and shook like an aspen leaf. Elder White said, "Will the doctor report her condition?" He replied, "She does not breathe." And rapidly he made his way to the door. Those at the door who knew of his boasting said, "Go back and do as you said you would. Bring that woman out of her vision." In great agitation, he grasped the knob of the door, but was not permitted to open it until inquiry was made by those near the door. "Doctor, what is it?" He replied, "God only knows. Let me out of this house." And out he went. It was evident that the spirit that influenced him as a medium was no more at rest in the presence of the power that controlled Mrs. White in vision than were the demoniacs in the days of the Savior who inquired, "Art thou come hither to torment us before the time?" Mark 8, verse 29. A similarity is seen in this circumstance to that recorded in the experience of Daniel the prophet. As he went into vision by the Spirit of the Lord, the Chaldeans who were present, heathens who knew not that Spirit, were greatly terrified and fled to hide themselves. Daniel 10, verse 7. Miss Harmon bidden to relate her visions. About 1 week after her first vision, at a meeting held in her father's house, Miss Harmon had a second vision in which she was bidden to make known to others what had been revealed to her. She was in great perplexity to know how she could do the Lord's bidding. Her health was so poor that she was in actual bodily suffering, and to all appearance had but a short time to live. She was but 17 years of age, small and frail, unused to society, and naturally so timid and retiring that it was painful for her to meet strangers. She prayed earnestly for several days and far into the night that this burden might be removed and laid upon someone else more capable of bearing it. But the light of duty never changed, and the words of the angel sounded continually, "Make known to others what I have revealed to you." While in this perplexed state of mind, Miss Harmon attended another meeting held at her father's house. In this meeting, the company all united in earnest prayer for her, and once more she consecrated herself to the Lord and felt willing to be used to his glory. While praying, the thick darkness that had enveloped her scattered, and as she afterward said, a bright light, like a ball of fire, came toward her, and as it fell upon her, her strength was taken away, and she seemed to be in the presence of Jesus and the angels. Again it was repeated, "Make known to others what I have revealed to you." She said that she earnestly begged that if she must go and relate what the Lord had shown her, she might be kept from exaltation. Then an angel told her that her prayer was answered, and that if she should be in danger of exaltation, she would be afflicted with sickness. The angel said to her, "If ye deliver the message faithfully and endure unto the end, ye shall eat of the fruit of the tree of life and drink of the river of the water of life." Miss Harmon's visit to Poland, Maine. Miss Harmon had been shown that she must go to Poland, Maine, and narrate her vision. The day after this third vision, unexpectedly to all, her brother-in-law drove up to the door of her father's house and proposed to take her to Poland. While there, she held a meeting in which she related the vision. Hazen Foss, being in despair, could not be induced to attend the service, but with his ear near to the door outside, he heard her recount her vision and said, "The vision she related is as near like what was shown to me as two persons could describe the same thing." The next morning, he unexpectedly met Miss Harmon and told her to be faithful in bearing the burden and relating the testimonies the Lord should give her, and she would not be forsaken of God. To others he said, "This is the instrument on whom the Lord has laid this burden. He surely ought to know, as he had seen the person in vision in which he was told that the burden was taken from him." Miss Harmon's work from that time was in going from place to place in the New England states, relating what had been shown her. In some instances, she was told in vision where to go, and also told what difficulties she would meet. Her messages were especially reproofs for those who were drifting into the doctrine of the spiritual advent of Christ, and encouraging all to hold on to the past experience. She says of her experience, quote, "Some refrained wholly from labor, and disfellowshipped all those who would not receive their views on this point. God revealed these errors to me in vision, and sent me to his erring children to declare them. But many of them wholly rejected the message and charged me with conforming to the world. On the other hand, the nominal Adventists charged me with fanaticism, and I was falsely and by some wickedly represented as being the leader of the fanaticism that I was actually laboring to do away." Close quote, Early Writings, page 72. Of this we shall learn more fully in the succeeding chapter. This is the end of chapter 13.